Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson, registered dietitian and umami enthusiast. Today, we're looking at the windy road that monosodium glutamate has taken in America. To be honest, I was initially thinking that I would do an episode on flavor avoidance in many pockets of America, and that MSG would just be one part of it. But after doing this interview with Kara Harbstreet, the backstory of MSG has kept both unfolding and unraveling. There are things we do know, what some people think we know, and then things we probably don't know for sure. And I'm not referring to the effects of MSG on the body, but we'll still get into that. In 1908, a Japanese professor named Dr. Akita was determined to bring the umami flavor of the seaweed soup his wife made for him to all of Japan. To do this, he isolated the glutamate in the soup that provided the savory flavor. It was then bound to sodium to make it into its salt form, and is a seasoning that ended up in grocery stores, pantries, and restaurants. Dr. Akita patented MSG and founded Ajinomoto to sell it. Today, the company is a Japanese multinational food and biotech corporation. For 60 years, the story seems pretty straightforward, and then it takes a turn. In 1968, the New England Journal of Medicine published a letter from Dr. Robert Ho Man Kwok, senior research investigator at the National Biomedical Research Foundation in Silver Springs, Maryland. He began his letter, quote, "For several years since I have been in this country, I have experienced a strange syndrome whenever I have eaten out in a Chinese restaurant." He goes on to say that he had symptoms including numbness in the back of the neck, gradually radiating to both arms and the back, general weakness, and palpitation. At the time, it didn't seem like he was blaming MSG entirely. He said it could be the high sodium levels in soy sauce or cooking wine, or maybe, quote, that it may be caused by the monosodium glutamate used to a great extent for seasoning in Chinese restaurants, end quote. That letter was the genesis of the term Chinese restaurant syndrome, and it's been around since. The author was looking to start a conversation and likely some controversy. The journal received many follow-up letters, and according to the Science History Institute Museum and Library, quote, the symptoms cataloged in the letters included fainting, back spasms, sweating, dizziness, flushed skin, and a numb jaw. Puzzling, though, no two letter writers listed the same symptoms, and the possible links between them was anyone's guess. They appeared all over the body and came on at widely varying times after eating, end quote. And they go on to say that, quote, stranger still, some doctors declared that the syndrome occurred only in certain geographical locations. New York and Southern California were deemed risky, while Hawaii and London were absolved. Nor could the doctors agree on the instigating ingredient. One blamed duck sauce, another frozen veggies. Others, mustard, wonton soup, or pufferfish venom. One even blamed the physical strain of Westerners' struggle with chopsticks. Of note, one neurologist explicitly absolved MSG, noting that he cooked with it all the time at home and never felt a thing. And the story of the author doesn't end there. In 2018, doubt was cast upon Dr. Ho Man Kwok as the original author of that letter. Dr. Howard Steele piped up that he had written the letter under a pseudonym. He states that in 1968, another doctor and colleague of his, Dr. Bill Hansen, bet him $10 that he couldn't make the pages of the New England Journal of Medicine as a simple orthopedic surgeon. Steele decided to prove him wrong and coined the term Chinese restaurant syndrome, capitalizing on anti-Asian sentiment at the time. And then Dr. Steele died months after his admission, and since then, his account has been called in question. So it's unclear who truly wrote the initial letter, but what is clear is that it relied on the pretty predictable xenophobia in America and furthered anti-Asian racism. It also dismissed Chinese food and East Asian food more broadly as inherently unhealthy and created the idea that MSG is unsafe and should be avoided by everyone. And as much as I'd love to know where the initial letter came from, and still might try to find out, in the end, the impact is the same. The multiple research articles since saying that MSG is safe if eaten in normal amounts, not the 20% of a rat's diet that had been studied in the past, cannot undo the ways that MSG has been demonized. And let's take a breather here and apply some common sense and critical thinking. If MSG inherently causes headaches and belly aches, wouldn't most of East Asia have them? And then, if we think back to the episode on Mediterranean diets with Shireen, we will remember that the population cohorts in Japan didn't have enough heart attacks or cardiovascular events for their diet to even be studied, which differentiated them from the rest of the testing locations, including Greece. Cut to today, and even after all the myth busting and research articles indicating that MSG doesn't inherently cause reactions in humans, the flavor enhancer is stigmatized. In any article or social media post, the top comment will say that the author or content creator is lying and that they themselves have a negative reaction to MSG, therefore everyone does and shouldn't eat it. The end. And people can have an inflammatory reaction to literally anything, but making a broad generalization, particularly about an ethnic food, is the questionable part. It was just last month that I was looking at a famous wellness doctor's Instagram content, and on the list of additives we should never eat was MSG. I got into the comments and asked about the biased research and was delighted when others there replied. One person said it made the list because people add it to food, and then it tastes good, and people are more likely to eat it, so we should avoid it. Another person said that MSG would, quote, make a nail taste good, and that's the reason we should avoid it. So we shouldn't eat it because it makes food taste good. I feel that this is a very uniquely American sentiment and needs further investigation. Anyhow, I recently came across a social media post of registered dietitian Kara Harbstreet addressing MSG demonization. You'll be familiar with her from my episodes about anti-diet dietitians who made cereal ads. She's part of Ajinomoto's current campaign for the New England Journal of Medicine to review the 1968 letter as part of the journal's efforts to recognize historical injustices in medicine and its journal. Today we hear more about MSG and that campaign from her. And a quick note that this was recorded before the election, and our discussions about science and health misinformation were prior to knowing how successful fear campaigns truly are. Kara, welcome back to the show.
Hi again. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so glad that you were here. I am hoping just right off the bat, you can tell us what MSG is and what it's not.
Yeah, that question has been, just rolling around forever, but it's actually a really simple answer. So MSG, monosodium glutamate, big sciencey sounding word, but the molecule itself is relatively simple. It's just a single sodium attached to an amino acid, and that amino acid is glutamate. And so that's the name. Mono meaning one, sodium, glutamate. So it is everywhere all the time. We were talking about some of the naturally occurring sources with, just tomatoes and mushrooms and Parmesan cheese. And it gives it that rich umami flavor. So like that depth of flavor that kind of makes your mouth water a little bit and enhances the flavor of anything else you might be cooking with. But it can also be added as a seasoning, as like a true flavor enhancer, because that MSG molecule is basically like isolated, pure umami.
So is MSG something that could be in your grandmother's cabinet or cupboard?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been around for generations at this point. So, you might have like a canister of like Accent is one brand that you'll find in a grocery store. Parents' generation or grandparents' generation would have seen it as that too. Ajinomoto is another one. So, it looks kind of similar to like a cross between salt and sugar. It's just this crystallized, really fine white powder. And it's oddly deceptive, like how little you need to actually make your food taste better. So, that canister of MSG that might be rolling around in the drawer, or, hanging out in the pantry, just a quick sprinkle, just before serving, or maybe as you're adding other seasonings or herbs and spices. That's really it. The simplicity is kind of the beauty of it because it's incredibly versatile. It's pretty inexpensive. The bag that I've got in my pantry back here, I think it's a 1 pound bag that was maybe $4 at my local Korean market. So, speaking of just the nostalgia of it too, it was around. It's not like this brand new ingredient that just burst onto the scene recently.
Mm-hmm. So what are some things that you would add it to?
Oh, my number one. I mean, we make stir fries all the time, but what it usually consists of is, a couple different kinds of vegetables, maybe like chicken thighs or ground beef. So we're using it for vegetables in a sauce or a marinade. It is amazing on something like, roasted potatoes or eggs. I mean, the versatility again is anything where you would normally use salt to give it a salty flavor.
Mm-hmm.
You could kind of like exponentially increase the depth of flavor by pairing it or replacing salt with MSG. So think of it that way. There's only a handful of instances I would say I would not use it. And that's probably baking. I mean, the chemistry of baking is just a little bit different than cooking. So if a recipe calls for salt, maybe, stick with the salt. But, maybe a sweet application, like, I'm not sure I would put it on top of like a fudge brownie or like salted caramel. Those are maybe a handful of exceptions I can think of.
Which means now I have to try them and see what that tastes like.
Yeah, actually report back. Your taste buds might say differently.
I know. We're going to have to try it. So what do you think the hysteria about MSG comes from?
Yeah, well, this is not my opinion alone. It's well documented over the years, but the hysteria really started back in the 60s. That was a pretty tumultuous time for a lot of people, but for Chinese Americans, it was really tough because that was around the time that a letter to the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine was published, basically framing this really vague cluster of symptoms like, headaches and, feeling lethargic, just again, things that kind of indicate, hey, you're a human who sometimes doesn't feel their best. But anyways, that letter was published and it really set off this concern that kind of rippled out across America that Chinese restaurants or Chinese cuisine was chock full of this mysterious foreign ingredient. MSG was blamed as the culprit. And in the decades since, there was some not so well-designed studies that came out kind of indicating, hey, there actually could be some potential health consequences. And that, again, just added fuel to the fire of thinking that this is some quote unquote toxic ingredient that needs to be avoided, that Chinese American cuisine was inferior to the more Eurocentric diets that did not historically use MSG as an added seasoning. And so on and so forth. So in this day and age, if we fast forward to the present day, I think that history, like the original story, maybe gets buried, even though I would say, in comments, it does feel like people are chiming in and pointing out that fact of where it really started. But I think a lot of people either don't connect the dots fully or just aren't aware of that history. And so this belief that MSG is something to avoid is almost just absorbed in like our collective psyche. And it's just this ambiguous fact that you kind of take at face value, even if you don't recognize where it originated from or even who you first heard it from. So, you hear things like, oh, my aunt's friend's cousin is allergic, quote unquote allergic, even though it's not actually possible to elicit an immune mediated response to something that doesn't have a complete protein. Anyways, they'll say something like that. And it's sort of like, oh, I can detect it. I get an instant headache as soon as I take a bite of something with MSG. And so it's an interesting thing to grapple with because as a dietitian, I'm not one to just rush out and invalidate symptoms. I mean, as somebody is having that kind of reaction where they don't physically feel well, I'm not going to say it's the MSG, but there's something that's happening, whether it's, maybe like the nocebo effect. There's an interesting line of thought with something like histamine reactions, because histamines also show up in a lot of the same foods where we find glutamates or, MSG in naturally occurring sources. So, it's kind of contentious because, when I go into these conversations, it's not like I want to just call out that someone is racist. Like that's not the goal. But we do want to be really clear that the origins of that belief was rooted in a xenophobic myth that specifically targeted Chinese Americans and the food they were making and eating.
You mentioned what's needed for an allergic response. Can you say more about how MSG is isolated?
Sure. So I'll preface it by saying I'm not an allergist. I'm not even a food allergy specialist within the field of dietetics. But, it's one of the things that we've known about allergies and food sensitivities for a while, pretty common knowledge that you need to have a complete protein in order to elicit that immune response. So those amino acids are often described as like the building blocks of proteins.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of them that, we may make ourselves, like the body produces its own, and glutamate is one of them. There's also ones that we need to source from our diet. So those essential amino acids. But long story short, that's what prompts the immune system to recognize like, hey, this is actually a threat. I need to, be on guard to protect the body. And in the case of MSG, there is no complete protein. It only has one of those building blocks, a single glutamate. So not only is glutamate one of the most abundant amino acids out there, but again, it's one that the body produces. And as the research with MSG has gotten a little bit better, we've started to better understand what happens when you ingest it. So you eat it, you swallow it, it ends up in the GI tract. A lot of the absorption takes place before it ever really gets stored. It's not shuttled around the body and then, trapped in tissues. Ingested glutamate doesn't even really cross the blood-brain barrier. So even if you were to have a bolus, which is a scientific term for like a relatively, large dose in one sitting, such as a meal or a snack,
Mm-hmm.
that bolus dose doesn't really change the amount of circulating glutamate. And since it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, even though it can be this excitatory, element in the brain, it doesn't actually, spark this instant migraine or, headaches that might be attributed to it. So, headache societies and other experts have come out and said, we've kind of ruled this out as a potential cause. We're not saying that you aren't experiencing a migraine or something's not causing your migraine, but the likelihood that it is MSG and MSG alone is quite unlikely given the molecular structure and what we understand about allergies.
Mm-hmm. So what are all the processes that make MSG into the form that my grandmother has in her cupboard? How does it get there in a powder form?
I think this is such a cool process. I've yet to ever see it in person. If anyone's listening and, they're doing this, please invite me. I would love to tour. But it's fermented. In the early days when it was first isolated and discovered in Japan, it came from a dashi broth. So, that umami flavor compound was identified later, realized, hey, we can actually ferment other things without needing to go through this whole complex process of creating broth. And so these days, I believe it mostly comes from either like a cornstarch or a sugar beet, which is a little counterintuitive because, like I said, MSG is pure umami, and a sugar beet we think of going towards, granulated white sugar.
Mm-hmm.
But because, again, at the molecular structure, we're only really looking for that glutamate amino acid, we see that across the natural world. And so it's just a matter of how do we efficiently, get this out of another plant, ferment it, which is a process a lot of people are familiar with, whether it's, alcoholic drinks, kombucha, other fermented foods, or fermented dairy. And we essentially, in a very simplified way, ferment it down to the point that it can be granulated, packaged, and sold as MSG.
I'm trying. So I understand how to get sugar, but I'm wondering where and how would it be? You mentioned that you don't, you have not seen this. So of course we would like to. Do you envision it would be boiled and then taken off, or like the broth situation?
Yeah, I've thought about this almost like a distillation process. If you were to maybe do it from broth, I have to imagine there's other quote unquote impurities. So if you're really going for pure MSG, I think it looks different. I want to say, maybe don't quote me on this, maybe it's not posted anymore, but I do think at one point there was a YouTube video of someone who endeavored to extract, pure MSG at home, in a home kitchen. So all that to say, I think it can be done. I am just not 100% certain on what that would look like if you were to go out and try to attempt that yourself. And then of course at scale, when we're mass producing, this product for the market, of course, everything looks different when you're working at that scale. So again, if there's a way to ever see that process in action, I feel like I could die happy. I would be so interested to see that. I'm so curious.
Let's see if we can make that happen.
Yeah, I'm putting it out there in the universe, like you said. The worst I can say is no.
That's a good point. So if folks know someone, let us know. We will ask and eventually get a tour. Okay. Back to that letter, the 60s and the up till today. So I was born in the 80s and started eating Chinese food in the 80s. I never experienced a headache, and I thought that was weird. I was like, am I the special one who didn't have a headache after consuming Chinese food? Because it was just like the deal. So I came upon this topic on your Instagram.
Well, the campaign name is Revisit.
So what all is entailed?
Yeah, so the New England Journal of Medicine, or NEJM as we'll shorten it to say,
Sure.
has launched this effort to, I guess, revisit some of the problematic things they've published in the past. It's not even like an open secret anymore. It's just out there in the open. Like they've actively contributed to some of the racial stereotypes or, the poor reporting on disparities between racial and ethnic groups. So they have this series that's been ongoing since, I believe, maybe late last year, revisiting different topics. And given that they were the place that the original letter to the editor was published, that sparked this, wave of concern about Chinese American restaurants and MSG. The urging of this campaign was really just to say, hey, as you're doing this revisiting work, like include Chinese restaurant syndrome in that. Mm-hmm. So far, they have not responded. In full disclosure, I am a paid partner of that campaign, but have been talking about MSG for years. And that was the reason that I decided to join in, was because this just united a lot of influential voices in the space. So myself and a few other dietitians, a lot of chefs and culinary professionals and other science communicators to say, hey, New England Journal of Medicine, like you have some work to do around this topic. And to this point, anyways, at the time of recording, we are still waiting for a response. We have not heard or seen any indication that they plan on responding or plan to include Chinese restaurant syndrome as they revisit these past topics.
2 questions. What does that revisiting look like?
That's a good question. In my mind, it's revisiting not only the origin story, but I think also the science that has been published in the time since. For the origin story, there was some discrepancy at one point about whether the doctor who originally wrote the letter was who he said he was. Mm-hmm. There was another podcast that really explored that topic. They went so far as to interview a few family members to try and figure out, like, was this a real doctor? Like, was this a real guy, or was the whole story completely fabricated? Mm-hmm. So I think even just clarity around that could be helpful. Unfortunately, because people grow old and pass away, there are some things we may never get 100% clear answers on, but acknowledging that degree of confusion, I think, could be part of that work. I also think revisiting what has been published. I mentioned earlier, there were a series of fairly poorly designed studies that just did not replicate what it would look like to consume or use MSG in a practical setting. Mm-hmm. So I think really getting clear on the fact that a lot of these were animal studies, a lot of them used extremely unrealistic amounts of MSG. And not only that, they were paired with extremely unrealistic, ingestion methods. Mm-hmm. So when we as humans use MSG to season our food to enhance flavor, we're not taking a syringe of a highly concentrated liquid and injecting it like straight into organs. That was the methodology used in a few of these studies. I think also getting clear on what that threshold of safety is. We can look to other global cuisines across East Asia where, these are just umami loving cuisines. It is in everything. And we can actually quantify the amount of free glutamates or, quote unquote, naturally occurring MSG that a population would consume. And compare that to what we might typically eat with a more Americanized diet and just put it into context. I think helping people understand that realistically, you're not going to overconsume or have too much MSG for a couple of reasons. Like, one, as we pointed out, you're not ingesting an extreme amount in these unrealistic ways. You're just using it as you might use a salt shaker or any other seasoning. The second reason is that it's actually self-limiting. This pure umami flavor can get really intense really quickly. And at a certain point, if you've added quote unquote too much, your food just isn't going to taste good anymore. You've defeated the whole purpose of enhancing flavor and making it more palatable. So your taste buds are going to send that message to your brain and you'll register, hey, this doesn't taste good anymore. I'm not going to finish this meal or I'm not going to eat it. It doesn't taste good. So for those reasons, again, I think just contextualizing what it means to use it in practice. And then I think finally, part of the revisiting work can say, we're not recommending it outright. We're not promoting it for everyone all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We just want to set the record straight that it has been established as something that is safe to consume in typical amounts if you want to. And I think that last part is maybe most important. It's optional.
Sure. And the campaign is specifically for NEJM.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you're interested, you can, find the hashtag, which is just hashtag revisit CRS, Chinese restaurant syndrome.
Got it.
And like I said, you'll see some posts from chefs, other dietitians, science-minded folks who have really dug into the history and the science there. So it's not just me spouting off my own very obvious personal bias as someone who loves umami flavor, but, we really have sourced the information. We've done our own research as well as reviewed existing research to form the same opinion, which is rooted in the facts that, again, the origin story was rooted in a racist, xenophobic myth. NEJM had a part to play in sharing that story very publicly. And now we're really just urging them to revisit the topic and say, hey, we fumbled that. We need to do better.
And since I have you, do you mind if we go into more of the hysteria of it all? I know you recently posted and critiqued someone who was concerned that you were talking about something that was on Fox News. So can you tell us more about what is going on overall and your thoughts on things?
Yeah, I mean, what a time to be alive, right?
What a time to be a dietitian.
Yeah, what a time to cross it up with an election year. We've got, influencers at Senate roundtables. I mean, it's an interesting time to be working, not just in healthcare, but, nutrition communications, like trying to share credible information. I think where all this is kind of fitting in, I think we can trace it back to a lot of just general chemophobia, like this fear of chemicals, these unknown, like very intangible components that are everywhere, right? Like they're in the food, they're in the water, they're in the air, they're in the soil, they're in our clothes. So this, line of thinking, I don't think is unfounded. I think if you're someone who values health, who wants to maintain or preserve your health for the long term, who wants to age well, who wants to be around for your family, these are valid concerns. I think, at least what I'm noticing, I think where we start to kind of like skew into weird territory is when we start getting information that feeds into these concerns rather than informs those concerns. So, we see things like Fox News reporting on this Senate roundtable where not a single dietitian or other nutrition expert was present. Mm-hmm. That crosses over into some weird territory with, just like a civics lesson. Like, how do these Senate roundtables even get started? Why did we not know about it until after the fact? That's like a whole different tangent. Mm-hmm. But I think the fact remains, when you have this compelling story, we saw that in the example with, the letter to the editor of NEJM. We saw this with some of the people who sat and spoke on that roundtable. We see this with just, your average Instagram post, like, people building a platform off this compelling, emotionally driven story. That oftentimes speaks so much louder than the facts. And when you combine that with someone who sort of looks the part, like really embodies or epitomizes this version of health that a lot of people aspire to, then all of a sudden their voice seems so much more credible and authoritative than true experts in the topic. It's like we may have the knowledge and the expertise and more I guess, helpful information. But if we aren't as skilled at telling that story or getting it out there, the space becomes so oversaturated with these other voices that, the science gets drowned out.
Mm-hmm. If we don't look rich, people won't believe it as much.
I know. I mean, I could cosplay it if I really tried, but I think with the Senate roundtable, especially, it was so interesting because it's also maybe a good example of how politicized science in general has become. So looking at the ways that this, coincides or overlaps with other politicized issues. All of a sudden, I saw someone just scrolling through threads earlier today saying it's so odd that based on your opinion on raw milk, I can almost 100% accurately predict who you might vote for in this next election.
Yes.
So yeah, again, it's just a really weird time to be active in this space because I see so much of it, but it's like gushing from a fire hose. Like there's no possible way that I alone could combat every myth or inaccuracy about every little thing in the nutrition space. There's just no way. So I think we, meaning dietitians and other nutrition communicators, people who really value the science and want to help promote good information out there instead of misinformation, I think we kind of need to get it together and figure out like what will actually speak to this audience, to speak to people who share those concerns in a way that, I don't know, maybe gets to the root of it and helps us really get back on the same page of what's true and what's not.
Yeah, I was talking or texting with Shireen this morning. Like, what is the thing that we're not saying out loud? Because we're saying all these random pieces of information out loud. What is it that we're actually addressing? So, yeah, I'm always interested in what we're not saying.
Yeah, I think the piece I shouldn't say we're not saying it. I know we often do say it, but maybe not as publicly. What I think we're not really connecting the dots between, maybe is a better way to say it, is this like degree of individualism, like what you were saying with, diet being the biggest contributor to cancer. Diet. Like we as individuals are responsible for our health. That, what we personally decide to do or not do is directly related to any outcome. Therefore, if something bad happens, you must deserve it. That's like a really messed up thought, but table that for now. And then the other piece, I think, is this idea of American exceptionalism. Those two things in my mind are really closely connected because kind of loosely based around the idea I posed earlier about how politicized everything has become. It's kind of like there's a lot of people in the United States, not everyone, but a lot of people, you can maybe envision this person in your mind who think that America is the greatest thing ever, that we are excellent in every regard, that we can do no wrong. We are setting the global standard for everything. And I think it really bugs that person to imagine that we're not.
Interesting.
And so in my mind, again, we have this level of individualism connected to this idea of American exceptionalism and why aren't we as great as I think we should be? And then you combine that with the fact that, again, this space is so saturated with misinformation and intentionally deceiving information or incomplete information, whatever it is. And now you have all of that being validated, confirmed basically when you see very public headlines or coverage of things like, I know we keep using this example, but the Senate hearings. I think it's so interesting that a handful of people, Jordan Peterson and his daughter were there. They're Canadian. Like, maybe we should be asking, why do a lot of these really influential, celebrity doctors or influencers or whatnot, like, why do they feel the need to come to the United States to sell their whatever they're grifting? Why are they incapable of doing that in their
Great question.
That's an interesting question. So those are loosely assembled and organized random thoughts on all of that.
I think that's great. Food and curiosity and critique is one thing. Like the jump to conspiracy theories is fascinating to me.
Oh my gosh. Yes. In my mind, every time I see that, like, make America healthy again, my brain immediately goes like, how about we make America think critically again?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a quote, I don't know who to attribute this to. It's not my own, but it's like the one that says, when you don't know how anything works, everything sounds like a conspiracy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really unfortunate because I feel for that person who is craving information. They just aren't really sure where to get it from or who to believe. That is an overwhelming, almost like debilitating state to be in because your mind is just grasping at anything that can anchor itself to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to acknowledge that, you know, like human brains are wired to seek out information. Like we're naturally curious. We want to learn. It's maybe just a matter of helping people identify like, hey, this is why this isn't a credible source. This is why, you know, it's not actually the conspiracy you've built up and the story that you've been told. I think there's a fine line in those conversations. It's tough to get into discourse about this because, you know, again, with everything being as politicized as it is and the conspiracy theories that abound, it's sort of like walking on eggshells because you want those conversations to happen, but you're never sure, like, what is the one thing I'm going to say or offer up that's going to shut it down? Like, what's going to send this person away in the opposite direction instead of like sitting in that discomfort, like applying those critical thinking skills, like working through it as we like verbally process it together. That's what I personally really enjoy doing. I think that's often framed as like a debate or, you know, some kind of battle where there's a winner and a loser. And it's like, well, we're really just trying to have a conversation and we often can't even get to that point. Yeah. Wow. We've really come a long way starting out with MSG makes food taste so good. Here we are.
Oh, goodness. So that'll be like 5 more podcasts. We'll definitely bring you back to talk about critical thinking in gray area. I think that'd be a good fit.
Well, I loved coming on to talk with you more. I love that you're trying to get this in front of critical thinkers. I mean, again, I love these conversations that are just so difficult to have on a platform like Instagram. Like we could never capture this in a, you know, Instagram caption or like a 5-second video clip. I mean, I think this is maybe part of the work too, is just, you know, getting into more conversation about it because again, I'm not here to necessarily say that anyone's opinion is right, wrong, or otherwise, but it's kind of like the facts are the facts. We all have our opinions. Let's air them out in the open and talk about it.
Yeah. Which I love. Say the things out loud. Yeah. Please. And Milton targeted.
That's right. Yes. The Dems are controlling the weather. News to me was
those are facts. Those are facts.
Oh, man. Every day.
Let's bring our facts to the table.
Yeah. It's like, again, so close. Oh, you think humans caused this?
Right.
In a way, we contributed significantly. You're very close to getting it.
All right. Kara, thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you. Always a pleasure to chat with you. I'm glad we could do it again.
Thanks so much to Kara for coming on the show. Our conversation and some of the videos of white American food that people just happen to be sending me during the holiday season, no pun intended, have me thinking about flavor, and I'll be returning to that topic with my dad. Until then, I hope your food is well seasoned and that you're staying moisturized and awkward this fall. I'm Jessica Wilson, and you've been listening to Making It Awkward. If you're looking for a way to make friends, you can now buy Making It Awkward merch on my website. You can become a Patreon member of the show and make it sustainable. You can leave ratings, reviews, and comments that my dad will read aloud on the podcast. And you can email the show and tell me how terrible MSG is for you at makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. The show is edited by the flavorful Jen Jacobs, is a production of The Bodied Politic and supported by Patreon members and the legacy of Sacramento Outward Services.